So hello there and welcome to this revision video about peacemaking. This is the first topic, part 1, topic 1 of the AQA GCSE History, Conflict and Tension 1918 to 1939. So let's find out about this topic. We're going to talk about the aims of the different peacemakers. We're going to talk about Wilson and the 14 points. We're going to talk about George Clemenceau, the leader of France, and David Lloyd-George, the leader of Britain, and the extent to which they achieved their aims at the Paris Peace Conferences, and in particular at the Treaty of Versailles. So the First World War came to an end after 4 years on the 11th of November 1918. Now, you probably know from your own knowledge that the First World War was a stalemate for much of the conflict between 1914 and 1918, with the two sides bogged down with trench warfare. But during the summer and the autumn of 1918, the failure of Germany's spring offensive very much saw the war change in favour of Britain and France, partly, or very much down to the economic and military support of the United States of America, who had entered the war in 1917. This, combined with the sort of economic impact of the British blockade of German ports, had led to lots of problems in Germany, and it created the pressure which meant that the German leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicated in November 1918. Now, an armistice was signed between Germany, France, Britain and the USA on the 11th of November 1918. Now, an armistice is simply an agreement to actually stop the fighting and to begin the peace discussions. But it's useful and I think important to note that the armistice itself actually contained a number of agreements that were made, and that included the demilitarization of the Rhineland. So you can see there on the map there is some information about where the Allied soldiers went at the end of the First World War. So the Rhineland area was demilitarized, which you can see that land in yellow, and it was actually occupied by American soldiers and French soldiers and British soldiers after the 11th of November 1918. Germany also had to surrender ships, machine guns and planes, and the blockade of German ports continued all the way up until the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June 1919. So some of the ideas, such as things like the demilitarization of the Rhineland, had actually been agreed already at the armistice in November 1918. So let me introduce you to the big three. So these three individuals were the key people at the Treaty of Versailles. George Clemenceau on the left there, he was the harshest in terms of his aims. David Lloyd-George was kind of in the middle. He was the Prime Minister of Britain. And then Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States of America, on the right of the picture there, and he was the most lenient. So it's worth you thinking about them in that order. So let's start off with George Clemenceau. So what did George Clemenceau, the leader of France, want to achieve at Versailles? Well, it's important to note that most of the fighting in the First World War took place in France and Belgium. So obviously France had suffered a lot of damage. Mines, railways, factories, bridges and farmland had been destroyed. The French themselves had suffered many deaths. So many people within France were seeking revenge from the Treaty of Versailles. And Clemenceau's aim is to make sure that Germany is punished so harshly that it can never be powerful enough to attack France again. So he wanted its armed forces reduced massively. He wanted Germany's border to be pushed back to the River Rhine. In fact, that area we looked at before on the map, the Rhineland, he wanted that to become an independent country. He wanted Germany to pay massive amounts of compensation. We're going to call that reparations, so that money could be used to actually rebuild France. Now, David Lloyd-George, he had actually promised in a British election in 1918 that he was going to, quote, make Germany pay. So many people in Britain in 1918 are looking for revenge. However, Lloyd-George himself was concerned that if the treaty was too harsh, then it may cause Germany to seek revenge. And in fact, after the actual Treaty of Versailles, David Lloyd-George wasn't particularly happy with the treaty that they come up with. He also saw a strong Germany within the centre of Europe as an important way of protecting the rest of Europe from the advance of communism. Obviously, with the takeover of power of the communists, of the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917, that was something that Lloyd-George was concerned about. He wanted Germany to remain strong enough for trading as well, so that was an important aspect of his ideas. And of course, the British Empire was at the forefront of David Lloyd-George's mind. He hoped to gain German colonies, and he wanted to make sure that the British Navy was powerful too. Now, Woodrow Wilson A bit of an idealistic character, Woodrow Wilson. Remember, no fighting actually took place in America. Wilson didn't want to be too tough. He wanted to see Europe rebuilt so that Europe was going to be strong and that America could continue to trade with Europe. His idea was the League of Nations, a kind of world parliament where countries would work together. He also believed in the idea of self-determination, that countries themselves should be free to rule themselves and decide who should run them. He also had the idea that trading ships should be able to go everywhere. This was called freedom of the seas. So it's very important that you're aware that his ideas are very much summed up by the concept of Wilson's 14 points, and this was a speech that he made in January 1918. So that's one of the key concepts to be aware of. So the peacemakers, Clemenceau, Lloyd-George and Wilson, have very, very different aims indeed that they want to achieve at the Treaty of Versailles. So representatives from the major countries in the world gathered in Paris at the end of the First World War in 1919 to come up with the different peace treaties. And in fact, all the treaties at the end of the First World War, such as Versailles, Trianon, Neuilly, Saint-Germain, Sèvres, etc., they're all named after districts of Paris. Now, 30 countries are represented at Versailles, but it's only Britain, France and America that really count. And these are the key issues that they're debating and discussing about at the Paris Peace Conferences. So first of all, what should happen to the Kaiser? People in Britain are saying that he should be hanged. The Kaiser actually went to Holland after the First World War, and they refused to give him up, and he was actually allowed to stay living there until his death. What about the power of the League of Nations? Well, Clemenceau wanted the League of Nations to be very, very strong with its own army. Britain and America are more reluctant. They didn't want their soldiers to actually have to fight in different conflicts like that. So it meant that when they set up the League of Nations never had its own army and would in effect have to borrow its soldiers from its member countries, which is not particularly a realistic proposition. Countries in Eastern Europe, they've got to decide what they're going to do with the countries in Eastern Europe. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of change with the borders of Russia, Germany, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example. Wilson had promised an independent Poland. The Allies also agreed to give independence to Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, which were states which Germany had taken from Russia in 1918. So those countries all became independent. So the independent Poland was quite important, and that's going to be an important feature in terms of international relations in the 1920s and 1930s. In terms of whether Germany should be blamed for the First World War, this was a controversial topic, but all of the big three actually agreed that Germany should be blamed for starting World War I and therefore should face punishment in the form of reparations for that. Quite controversial and very unpopular that in Germany, because there was very much a sense in Germany that they were actually not to blame for the First World War. And we'll look more about that in future revision videos. What about Germany's colonies? So Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, in his whole idea of world politics, Weltpolitik, had sought an empire. So the big three agreed to take all of Germany's colonies away, and Germany's colonies became what are called mandates, which means they were countries, they were areas that were to be controlled by the League of Nations. They also agreed to reduce the size of the German army. Britain and America were worried about communists moving into Germany, so they wanted Germany to have enough soldiers to be able to defend themselves from that. Now, France wanted them to very much go further and wanted Germany's armed forces to be completely reduced, but Britain and America certainly didn't think that was practical. In terms of land lost, obviously Germany's going to lose land as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, but the main disagreements were over the Rhineland and the Saar. Now, the Rhineland is that area on the border of France to the west of the River Rhine, and the Saarland, again, is a border area with France, which contained a number of important industrial coalfields. France wanted the Rhineland to be independent, and France also wanted control of the Saar. Now, in the end, what they agreed to do is to demilitarize the Rhineland so that Germany couldn't put soldiers in the Rhineland. And then the Saar was basically controlled by the League of Nations for 15 years. And then there was a plebiscite which did actually take place, a plebiscite which is a type of referendum to decide whether France or Germany should control the Saar area. And then reparations, the big three agreed that Germany should pay reparations, but they couldn't agree on a figure. So a special commission was given 2 years to decide on the amount that should actually be paid, and that actually delivered its verdict in 1921. So the main terms of the Treaty of Versailles are And it's important you have some examples of that. In terms of land, they lost lots of land in lots of different places. One of the most famous ones is that they lost Alsace-Lorraine to France. The Rhineland was demilitarized. In terms of army, only 100,000 soldiers, no navy, no air force, only 6 battleships, no submarines. In terms of money, we talked about that a little bit before, but the big three could not agree the price of reparations. The French wanted 44 billion, the British 24 billion, and the Americans 4.4 billion, so there's a huge difference. So a commission was set up to decide the final bill, which reported in 1921. And in terms of blame, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany had to accept the blame for starting the war. So in terms of how satisfied the big three were with the Treaty of Versailles, I think this is quite an interesting question to look at. David Lloyd-George very famously said, quote, "We will have to fight another war in 25 years' time and at 3 times the cost." Lloyd-George was pleased with a number of things, not least the fact that although the German colonies were League of Nations mandates, in effect Britain and France were going to gain control of them. He was also pleased that the German navy was restricted so that Britain would regain and have naval supremacy. Remember, there had been a big naval arms race between Britain and Germany before the First World War. But he was also concerned that the loss of German land and the harshness of the treaty would cause problems in the future. Most British people at the time were very, very content with the Treaty of Versailles, but there were a few dissenting voices. People like the Archbishop of Canterbury spoke out against the Treaty of Versailles. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes wrote a very famous book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1919, which was very critical of the Treaty of Versailles. And actually that helped to sway quite a lot of people's opinions in Britain about the Treaty of Versailles perhaps being too harsh. So although initially most people in Britain supported the Treaty of Versailles, many people came to criticise it in later years. So by the 1930s, there was very much a sense the treaty had been too harsh. Now, in terms of France, George Clemenceau was pretty angry about the treaty. He was angry that Germany retained 100,000 soldiers. He felt the Rhineland should have been taken from Germany. He wanted the Saarland permanently and felt the reparations agreed would be too small. So he basically had wanted Germany crippled financially and militarily forever, and that didn't happen. So he was pretty upset about it. The French public, again, they wanted Germany to be punished. They were pleased that the soldiers were no longer going to be in the Rhineland and they had some control over the Saar, but many people in France thought the treaty should have been tougher. Clemenceau himself lost the French presidential election, showing, I think, probably a verdict on Clemenceau himself and what he'd been able to achieve at the treaty. Now, Woodrow Wilson, he was content with many aspects of the treaty, although perhaps would have liked a little bit more self-determination within it. Woodrow Wilson's main problem was that the treaty was very unpopular within America, and many people in America thought that Woodrow Wilson hadn't been able to get enough of his ideals into the treaty. The rival Republican Party in America used the Treaty of Versailles to criticize Wilson, and the US Senate, which is like a little bit like their parliament, they refused to agree to the treaty, which meant that America never actually joined the League of Nations. Now, this is an absolutely crucial event when we're looking at this international relations topic. And Wilson tried in subsequent years to tour America, persuade America to join the League of Nations, to get rid of this, what was called an isolationist approach. But isolationism, the idea that America should not be involved in European conflicts and wars, and in things like the League of Nations, dominated American politics in the 1920s and the early 1930s. So in America, many people felt the treaty was unfair on Germany. There was a sense that Britain and France were becoming rich at Germany's expense, and therefore we had this policy of isolationism. So I suppose in all three of the big three had things that they could be happy with, but also things that they would have been frustrated with and angry about. So none of the big three were fully satisfied with the Treaty of Versailles. So in terms of a source focus, you can see here that this source very much from the British satirical magazine Punch, talked about world events at that time. It's very common in this exam to get lots of cartoons, particularly for the first question. The caption reads, "Giving him rope and the German criminal says to the Allied police, 'Here, I say, stop, you're hurting me.'" And then there's an aside, which means talking away from the hearing of the so-called Allied police. He says, "If I only whine enough, I may be able to wriggle out of this yet." And I think the idea that Germany was complaining about how it's treated at the end of the First World War, this is very much a perception of how some people, particularly in Britain and France, may have regarded Germany at that time, that if they were complaining about their harsh treatment, it was just because they were trying to get out of taking responsibility for their actions in the First World War. So certainly the attitude of countries like Britain and France in particular to Germany in 1919, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, was very much about punishment and not trusting Germany. And obviously international relations at that time were pretty frosty, and although those would improve certainly in the 1920s, it's important to kind of think about what the attitudes were like in terms of international relations in 1919. So that's been a revision video, just looking at the first part of the course there, looking at the aims of the big three and looking at some of the key events of the Treaty of Versailles of 28th of June 1919. That was signed at the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in France. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.